there are things going on that have an impact on your life and on our country's national security. And I'm going to show you some things that the senior leaders, both of our country and also some of the opinion leaders, are taking things in a direction that are not in your favor and that are going in directions that you probably don't want them to go into. Now, as everyone knows, the context here for what we're going to talk about is that over the weekend, the city of Avdiivka has fallen to the Russians much faster than a lot of people thought on the last phase here, because Zelensky had fired his commander. Zelensky had put a new guy in, Sersky. Just a couple of days before it fell, Zelensky went on and told everybody, hey, I am putting in a new commander here. We're going to bring more resources to bear. We're going to hold this city. And then 2 days later, it falls. So now then they're trying to do some damage control. Now, it couldn't have come at a worse time for Zelensky, because he was going to the Munich Security Conference where he was going to be a featured speaker. And of course, his intention and desire was to get a new round of support from Western Europe, new equipment, more money, all of those kinds of things. He was on the world spotlight. Everything was on him. The last thing he wanted was for this to happen. Now, instead of being honest about what happened and the setbacks on the front line, many of the Western leaders are just like completely oblivious to it and are pretending like it didn't happen or that it's not really a big deal. Here's how on, I believe it was Saturday, President Biden addressed the issue. And he says, yeah, we're just going to keep trying looking for more cash.
The idea that we're going to walk away from Ukraine, the idea that we're going to let NATO begin to split, is totally against the interest of the United States of America, and it is against our word we've given since all the way back to Eisenhower. So it's about time we make sure that Congress come home and pass the legislation funding NATO. It's critical.
Now, President Biden is having on the same track that so many others in the West are having, that actually, you know what, if we just get that money squeezed out of Congress, then everything will change on the battlefield. But folks, I'm just telling you point blank, that money won't make any difference. And if you need any encouragement or any backup on that, just consider that in the first 18 months of the war, we gave them over $200 billion total from the U.S. and Western Europe, thousands upon thousands of combat vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. And it not only did not push Ukraine forward, it's now not stopping Russia from moving further to the west. So the idea that 60 billion is going to make a difference when 200 billion didn't is just irrational in the top. But that's not stopping our leaders from continuing to push that line, as from Munich, you had the Vice President of the United States throw her 2 cents in.
The President and I, President Biden and I, will continue to work to secure the resources and weapons that you need to succeed. We will work to make sure Russia pays damages to Ukraine. President Zelensky, as President Joe Biden and I have made clear, we will be with you for as long as it takes.
That is delusional, folks. There's no kinder way to put that. That with Russia on the advance, moving to the west, 2 years of war have not gotten Ukraine to budge Russian forces out, even after a massive attempt at an offensive last year. And you're one leading with, we're going to force Russia to pay reparations, and then that we're going to stay as long as it takes, oblivious to what's actually happening on the battlefield. That is bizarre. Unfortunately, she's not the only one. In fact, it's like they brought out all the popular names in Munich to say this kind of things, as though words alone can change what you're seeing physically on the battlefield right there, especially in Avdiivka. So we had Ben Hodges, who was unfortunately one of the easiest targets to put up and show this, because he's on TV all the time, and he was also in Munich and added this.
I don't agree that the Russians have the upper hand. Clearly, at this point, as we begin or come to the end of the second year of the large-scale invasion, neither side can knock out the other. The Russians do not have the ability to finish off Ukraine. Ukraine does not have, at this point, the ability to defeat Russia. The United States, we're screwing ourselves, if I may say that. I mean, it's in our interest that Russia is defeated by, it's in our interest that NATO is strong. And the strategic illiteracy of former President Trump and some of his enablers is a danger for the United States, not just for Europe.
So you have Hodges saying that it's actually a danger to the United States not to give this money, oblivious to the facts that I just pointed out. 200 billion equals a loss of territory, that somehow 60 billion, if they get it all tomorrow, is somehow going to make a difference. And in fact, if we don't give it, it's dangerous. Well, that very Congress who he's saying that should pass this money, some of those members of Congress, especially in the Senate, have a somewhat different view.
The image would be the migrant in New York who assaulted a police officer, was freed from jail on no bail, and gave the middle finger of both hands to America. That's what this bill is. It's the middle finger to America. This bill is the middle finger to every working man and woman in America, every struggling American family. This bill gives them the middle finger and says, we don't care about you. We care more about Ukraine than we care about our southern border.
And, you know, a great many of you, I'm certainly one of them, do care about American national security. And when I see the President of the United States and many in both the Republicans and Democrats, the House and the Senate, are all saying, here's this national security bill, which doesn't include anything about American national security, but does give a lot of money over to Ukraine and also to Israel and also to Taiwan. That's where all this cash is going. And you got to wonder, why do we call it American national security bill when it doesn't include any money for American national security? That's a fair question. I think that we should ask a question, or we should have an answer to. Well, it doesn't take much ingenuity to figure out what's really going on here, at least a large measure of it. We had this in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. This headline popped up there, and I think it's pretty self-evident there. How the war in Europe boosts U.S. economy. It's all about the cash, and we've shown you that many times. When Zelensky was here in December, and how he had all that smiling like school. Now that one right there, this is his most important meeting with all of the heads of all the defense contractors who were smiling broadly, ear to ear, about all the cash that they're going to get. And you had, let's say, I think it was Secretary of State Blinken a few months back said, hey, the war's a win-win because we get money for our industry. That should not be what drives your tax dollars into someone else's hands. Our economy doesn't need more bombs and bullets to do well. There's a lot of other things that we could spend that money on, or we could just not borrow it. But if you talk about national security, if you want to spend something, let's first of all make sure that our border is actually secure. And again, I say this all the time, whatever the policies are, the immigration policies, who you let in, who you don't, how many, all that, that's all fair game. And that's something that Congress should debate and come up with a good policy. But no matter what the policy is, we should know who does and doesn't come in our country. We should have the border secured so that we protect ourselves from people we don't want in, and we don't even know who it is. I think I heard that the number this morning is like 1 million people that have come into the country in just the last few months, and we don't even know who they are. And the numbers just keep rolling and keep getting bigger as Congress, and look, they both deserve some blame for this. Both chambers, both parties, because they can't figure anything out. Neither is willing to make a compromise, and the border stays insecure. That's just the truth of it. But we need to do what is in our interest, and we need to focus on what is going to be helpful to America. And part of that is that we've also got to be able to acknowledge when something isn't working. Now, we keep saying that, and Hodges keeps saying there that, oh, well, Russia hasn't won. We have to weaken them. They're not as, they don't have the ability. Well, they just show they do in Avdiivka. They do have some ability here because Ukraine wasn't able to hold them. And it has nothing to do with whether this 60 billion was approved or not, because this is money and funds from a long way back. Also at this Munich Security Conference, one of the leaders of Estonia, actually, I don't know if he intended to, but he admitted that things are not going in the direction of Ukraine. And in fact, the Russian army is more powerful now than it was at the start.
Russia is pushing forward. It is true it has lost a lot of resource, but they're also investing a lot. The Russian military at the moment is, from manpower-wise, it is bigger than it was before the war started. So despite the losses, they've been able to invest enough manpower through mobilization or through recruitment to fuel the war machine.
Meanwhile, on the battlefield, one of the reasons why Ukraine lost in Avdiivka, one of the reasons, and there's many more, I'm going to talk about those in just a second, but it's the classic, what they call shell hunger, because they can't keep pace with the Russians, because as the Estonian minister there talked about, the Russian military industrial complex, because it is an existential fight for Moscow, have been kicking into high gear. And now after the last year of intense spin up for that, they actually do have a lot of shells, and they now can provide it domestically. They don't have to worry about getting so much stuff from North Korea and Iran as they had last summer. Now then they're starting to produce it indigenously, and it's having an effect on the battlefield, as this expert from the UK explains.
There's no doubt whatsoever that the Ukrainian army is suffering what has been called for the last, well, the term it goes back to the First World War, shell hunger. They are outmatched somewhere between 4-1 and 7-1, some say more in some places, and it's certainly contributed to Bakhmut. But the challenge of the West is, even if US assistance in the form of money comes through, where this new ammunition is going to come from. This was a problem throughout last year as well, and it was a problem because the West simply doesn't have the ammunition or won't give what ammunition it has. It's not really a question of money at the moment. There's also the issue as well, it's rather more complex, of different kinds of ammunition, and Dmytro Kuleba raised this at the Munich Security Conference. That, look, this is a complex issue. There's no doubt whatsoever Ukraine is in real trouble with respect to artillery, but one is slightly lost as to what the solution may be over the next year.
Now, that was one of the most important things I wanted to point out that this expert highlighted here. It's not just about the cash. If Congress met this afternoon and said, you know what, forget about our own southern border, forget all those studies, here's the cash. Today, we'll just put it on a plane and fire it on over there or wherever it needs to go. It's a matter of what the money can buy. You can't throw wads of dollars at the Russians. What you have to have is artillery shells, and it's a much bigger issue of producing the shells than anyone wants to admit. It's going to be 2025 before the U.S. is producing. I think the number is like 250,000 shells per month, and that's a good enough to get by about a week of normal intensity in Ukraine. So in a year plus from now, we might be at the point where we could supply them for a couple of weeks of normal intense, if they even last that long. But the shells just aren't there right now. So to continue fighting, to continue saying we're going to press forward and this money will help us is to either be unaware that that's how combat power works, that there's long lead times. You had Kirby go for the American people toward the end of last week and actually claim that the reason why at that time Avdiivka might fall is because we won't push this money out, as though everything is hinging on this cash. And as soon as the cash breaks, then here comes the shells. But as this expert just correctly pointed out, that's not how it works. So it's going to be a long time before the shells change, even if all of the money was there, because the shells just aren't there. And the industrial capacity in the cumulative West is not capable of producing them at scale. That's the hard truth. So if that be the case, and then if our leaders are oblivious to that and they keep saying, no, we're not going to work anything about a negotiated settlement, we're going to keep pushing forward to win, then you see a big, big problem, because we're trying to produce something that can't be produced. We're trying to accomplish an outcome that militarily, industrial, and economically is not attainable. Well, what is that going to result in? What is going to be the consequence on the battlefield? Now, if you ask Brother Zelensky, he is still in his same, frankly, delusional state when he's saying this.
Conversation with President Biden, very important points, including about Avdiivka and the need for continued principled and sufficient support for Ukraine. Meetings with congressmen, representatives of both parties, both houses of the U.S. Congress. And each such conversation clearly confirmed the key point. Ukraine alone can stop Putin and create conditions for him to be punished for all the evil he has done.
I mean, that's like some of these previous experts I'm saying, that, like Kamala Harris saying we're going to fire war reparations, require them from Russia, even though they're in the catbird seat right now. even though all the fundamentals of the building of combat power show that the Ukraine side is not going to win, that they may not even be able to stave off a defeat. That's the more likely outcome right now. The probability is higher that Ukraine will lose the war and that their military may eventually just completely crack and crumble and fall apart. That's the higher possibility right now. And the evidence on the ground is overwhelming that that's the case. Now, in the aftermath of this loss of Avdiivka, here's what it looks like on the ground. This is the ground truth reality. We always go back to what the ground truth reality is. And here's a quick assessment of what's going on and what may come next.
Western sources reports about that currently there are 5 directions of Russian attack, and Robotyne is not the only one. According to information we have from the Western sources, from CNN News, the Russians concentrated around 40,000 soldiers in the vicinity of Mariupol, for example, 40,000 soldiers, and I remind you that the Russians used the same number of forces, around 40,000, to storm Avdiivka. And when talking about Mariupol, these 40,000 the Russians can use for offensive operation in the direction of Novomikhailivka and Ugledar. So in the very near future we might see another Russian attack, primary attack, and also the Russians reported that they concentrated around 110,000 soldiers in the vicinity of Kupiansk-Liman. So once again, as we discussed yesterday, Robotyne offensive operation may be just a primary attack with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to redeploy reserves in this area, and after the Ukrainians do this, the Russians will intensify their activity in Novomikhailivka, South Donetsk direction, or maybe on Kupiansk area.
Before I get into the next point here, that one of our viewers here, Peter Shin, made a comment here I want to put up on the screen. He says it's a matter of time before Kyiv becomes Kabul 2.0. I wanted to highlight that because I think there's a lot of truth to that, more than what people may recognize. One of the reasons why we failed in Afghanistan is because we refused to see the truth. We refused to acknowledge the ground truth reality that I had seen through my 2 combat deployments there. And I raised, especially in 2012, after the return of my second one, that all these people like David Petraeus were lying to America. They were saying things were getting better when I knew firsthand on the ground they were not, and that I warned expressly, if we don't make changes, we're going to lose the war. So when it did happen in August of 2021, it was not a surprise. It was, the only surprise to me was that it took as long as it did. But the reasons why are crucial to this point here. The reason why that war failed was because the government was so corrupt that it could not get the support of the people that it led. The military was incapable because they relied on us, and they never had complete confidence, even with 20 years, that they were going to be able to get it done. And instead of holding them accountable, instead of holding their government accountable for malfeasance, instead of making sure that their military was able to stand on its own, we continue to just feed them incremental bread here and turn a blind eye to all the things they do good, because it would have been embarrassment for us to actually have to hold anybody accountable. I mean, you know, Ashraf Ghani and his predecessor routinely were reported to be literal pallets of cash from the United States, which they ended up taking into exile. That's just the truth of it. So that fell apart because the army of ultimately in August of 2021, the end did come when the Afghan government's military literally crumbled and fell apart. That's, I think, the biggest risk, and the thing I'm most concerned about now, if we don't learn the lessons of Afghanistan, which is this war is not going to be won. Okay. The Ukraine military is now recognizing the same thing that the Afghan military did. They could see the writing on the wall because Trump actually made a deal. It says we're going to withdraw at that time. They could see that the money's not going to come. The Ukraine side, slightly different story. You hear the comments from our leaders saying we're going to be there as long as it takes again, but they know that's not the truth. They know that we gave them $113 billion, the U.S. alone, in the first year and a half of war, and now then the most we're even thinking about is 60. So about half of that amount, and they can see the squabbles within our Congress, and the money has not been released, and there's no guarantee it's ever going to be released. They see that. Now then they see further their own president being unwilling or unable to come up with a strategy that's going to win. He promised his people in early 2023, they had this big offensive that was going to go down to the Sea of Azov, cut the Russians in half, and that he was going to drive everybody out to the 1991 borders and win the war. That's what he told them all summer. When the offensive started to fail, they changed their story and said, well, it's just going to take a little longer than we anticipated, but it's still coming. So don't believe all this disinformation from the Russian side. Well, it turned out to be not disinformation. It was battlefield reality. But all of his soldiers see this. They see they keep being told all these promises, and then it doesn't happen. They see that a year ago in 2023 in May, when Ukraine and Zelensky said they were going to hold on to Bakhmut, Fortress Bakhmut, it fell. Now then they see 2 days before the city failed, again, they hear their commander-in-chief Zelensky say, hey, we're going to hold on to Avdiivka, and we're getting all the stuff that we need. And then 2 days later, it falls. Now, who are they going to believe? They're going to believe the U.S. members of Congress and our White House that keep promising all this stuff and it doesn't materialize? Are they going to believe their president who keeps making all these promises and then he can't deliver on the battlefield, and then he fires the one general that they actually like, puts in a new general that they don't like, who himself claimed he was going to lead the defense of Avdiivka, only to then turn around and let it go? Now, that's not entirely accurate either, because Zelensky did not, as he claimed in public, decide to let Avdiivka go to protect his people. He only did that because his orders were not being followed, because even the far-right Azov group, the neo-Nazi organization, abandoned the battlefield. They had the strongest position just outside of Avdiivka, from which they could have held on for a lot longer. They abandoned it. They just left. Once they abandoned it, then all the rest of the troops that were still stuck inside of Avdiivka also ran away from the battlefield. So now then they're trying to scurry to get to positions about 15 kilometers to the west of Avdiivka to try to man uncompleted defensive fortifications in anticipation of Russia coming up. On that video I showed you just a second ago from Military Summary Channel, there's 5 different areas along the front line where Russia is putting lots of pressure right now. And even as of this morning, they're continuing to make moves to the west. Now, as I also mentioned in there, there's a whole battle group of up to 40 to 60,000 that has been out of contact. So that they're fresh troops. Where they're going to go, where they're going to plug in there is unknown. Right now, Russia is moving up on 5 different points, and Ukraine doesn't have the reserves to keep moving back and forth, but they also may not have the will. When you know that your commander-in-chief just lost a battle here and lost control of it, that's the bigger issue. So he didn't have the ability. He gave orders for his troops to hold the city, and they chose not to. They disobeyed the order and ran. There's actually reports from the Ukrainian media this morning that the leaders of the Azov battalion actually are saying, you know what, we need to do some investigation and potentially bring criminal proceedings against the leaders of that battalion for failing to follow rules. Now, what do you think that's going to have an impact on the rest of the troops when they say the new guy comes in and immediately puts on trial the guys who did withdraw to save the lives of their troops? When they saw they were being asked to do the military possible to hold a position that had no value to it after the city was effectively gone already, you see that there's the chance that this actually goes much worse. So the troops on the ground in Ukraine are facing some really hard choices right now. And I promise you, from knowing just how normal soldiers talk and through history when similar things play out, I can assure you there's a lot of conversations going on in dugouts and foxholes right now among the Ukraine leaders and the troopers about saying, hey, I'm willing to fight and die for my country, but I'm not willing to commit suicide. These guys don't know what they're doing. And if you think that your side has a plan, and if it was Zelensky because he wanted to give up Bakhmut earlier, he wanted to give up Avdiivka earlier so that he could protect his guys and build stronger defensive lines. Zelensky, I got some issues with some of the choices he made, but he also did some really good stuff. And one of the things he was saying in, I think it was as early as December of last year, maybe even earlier than that, he recommended that they recognize the offensive didn't work in the summer, that they switch to the defensive and start doing what Russia had done the year before and build up much stronger lines of defense. Zelensky said no, because that would look weak. because he was worried about how things would look and not the reality on the ground. So they did not build those defenses. Now they don't have them, which means that even if they stand and fight, if Russia presses its advantage along this front, they may find an area where it's weak. and their troops don't have the ability to defend. If one of these 5 areas buckles, and then Russia moves those other troops, those fresh troops into that gap, everything could become unhinged. And the military history is shown, like, say, for example, in 1940, France had the strongest military on the European continent, bar none, to include more than the Nazi Germans, on the eve of World War II. But when the Germans had a penetration in the Ardennes area, and all of a sudden there was large numbers of tanks in the rear of the French side, they panicked. Even though they had 250,000 UK soldiers to bolster them, they panicked, and the whole lines buckled and everybody gave up because they didn't know what to do. They couldn't handle something happening that they didn't expect. The idea that the Ukraine military is not going to suffer that same loss if the same thing happens here is a gamble. It's not a risk, it's a gamble. And we don't know what's going to happen. For all I know, Ukraine could stiffen up and continue to make things difficult for Russia. Russia may not have the capacity to conduct a large-scale offensive operation, a penetration operation unplanned like that. I don't know. Until it happens, we can't say. But what I can tell you authoritatively is that all of the things that go into building combat power are on Russia's side and increasing by the day. I've been telling you this for months, and now that you can see it with your own eyes, and it's playing out on the battlefield. The longer our country, President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, these so-called experts that are talking nonsense left and right, Zelensky and his generals, as long as they keep holding on to the fiction of what they want to be true instead of what materially is true on the battlefield, they condemn more Ukrainians to die, more territory to be lost, more cities to be burned to the ground, and a better chance for Russia to gain even more territory than they have. What Ukraine should do, what President Biden should do, is acknowledge the reality, say we gave it our best shot, it's just not going to work. It's foolish to keep trying to do something that will fail, so that we don't repeat Afghanistan in 2021, where we see the army of our side buckle, and then the opponents just rush in and, like the Taliban did, and take over Kabul before we could even get out. That is much more real than anybody thinks. The chances of that happening are much higher than this fiction that our leadership and Zelensky is trying to sell to the world. Folks, it's just not going to work. And if we want to stop this slaughter, then we're going to have to do some things different. Otherwise, I'm afraid something much worse is going to befall the people of Ukraine. That's your deep dive for today. We're really sorry that Doug Macgregor wasn't able to be here. He's one of the favorites on this show, and certainly somebody I look up to a great deal. And we'll get him back on as soon as we get a shot. But we have coming up this afternoon with Matt Ho at 3 p.m. There's been more violence in the Red Sea, more violence in the region, and our troops continue to be at risk in Iraq and Syria, along with the situation in the Israeli Hamas war is not going as good as some of our leaders want to try to claim that it is, and I'll explain that this afternoon. Thanks, like and subscribe, and we will look forward to seeing you later this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.